Hello, and welcome to Sim.bc, where right now is 14:43. This is going to be a bit of a review video, not just a bit, this is going to be a review video. As usual, with the other projects that we've had over the last, 6 months, something along those lines, I usually go through what I'll take away from this experience, what I liked about it, what I learned about it, and how I might implement this in the future. Hopefully in that order, hopefully we will cover it all. Since yet again, this is kind of raw footage, raw material, so this is all based on my preemptive thoughts I had before actually moving into this video. Now, one thing I will start by saying that over the course of this What is Evil project that we've been talking about for approximately the latest 20 episodes, roughly. Given that there was an Easter special breaking it off, it was the April Fool's joke, and there was one or two SNRs in there as well. But usually it has just been the What is Evil that has been my main focus over the last, as I said, couple of 20 episodes or so, roughly. And moving into this project, I thought that this was one of the smaller projects that we would do. Turns out it was one of the larger ones. Because I thought this was going to be like maximum 3 to 4 videos. I mean, how much is there really when it comes to evil? But then I came up with a brilliant idea of actually splitting it up to, this is just my interpretation. So important to bear in mind as we move into this review is that I am not, and neither do I claim to be, a professional, right, within this area. I am no expert in the area of evil. I was going to say economics just because I had another thought in mind. I am no expert within evil or psychology. I'm actually studying economics. So keep that in mind as we're moving forward within this review, because there might be things that you're thinking is like, wow, that's obvious, and there are people who already came to this conclusions. Well, this is based on my interpretation of what I've been reading in this little project, right? So moving into the first part is that, what do I actually take away from this experience? Well, the thing that I take away is that I love working with a schedule. A schedule is always good. It's like 10 out of 10. I know what I'm going to do the next day. I know what I did yesterday. I know what I'm going to do today as well. It's bloody amazing, and I recommend everybody to actually work after a schedule. Another thing working with the schedule that has been happening is that since I know what I'm going to talk about, I can preemptively research this topic. So let's say that I'm going to work with the 7 deadly sins, as we did in with the mini review inside of this project, the sub project. Since I knew that I was going to work with the 7 deadly sins, if I had to happen to come across gluttony, for instance, as was my first one, and I read something that had to do with wrath simultaneously from the same source, I could save that source and read up on that a couple of days later, since I knew that I was actually going to tackle that subject further down the line. Which is really good, because that means that the effectiveness and the rate in which I find liable sources, or sources that I deem to be liable, right, is going to be increased, since I can actually save them, since I know what I'm going to talk about, which greatly increased the efficiency of actually working through different types of literatures, different types of articles, and different types of, mindsets, actually, different schools of thought when it came to evil. But probably why you clicked on this video is to get my understanding and my final idea of what evil actually is, and to actually state that, to get down to what is evil right now for me after doing this little project that could arguably be extended. It could have been shorter as well to come to kind of the same conclusion, maybe, but this is just where I chose to stop. But in order to describe it is to say what I thought about evil in the beginning. And as you can see, if you go to my video about pre-thoughts, right, of evil, is that really I had no idea what evil actually was. I think I came to the conclusion of something along the lines with that, if you're doing something continuously that's actually bad, and you think that it is bad, and you know that it's bad, then it's evil. Which, as of now, I come to the conclusion that probably isn't the case. Because imagine that you're going to do something that is bad, and you know it's bad, but you have to do it for another reason. Let's say that there is someone out there who is going to benefit from you doing this bad thing. Not necessarily that it's a corporation and you need a raise. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking more about an ethical dilemma here, even though that can be seen as an ethical dilemma. It actually probably is an ethical dilemma. Your financial gain over what is actually right to do. But imagine that someone that you like is in a bit of a despicable situation, right? They're in between a rock and a hard place, I'd say. And you can help that person with their decision, or you can help that person with their living standards, help them financially, whatever it might be. But in order to do that, you need to do something that is wrong. Since you know it's wrong and you're gonna do it anyway, because in your opinion, right, it yields something that is greater than the bad thing you're gonna do. And even if it doesn't, it might be the case that you think that, well, to me personally, this is going to be more worth to help that person over there than this bad thing is going to be to execute. That means that even though you know it's a bad thing and you're doing the bad thing, you're not necessarily doing it because you're evil, you're doing it to help someone else. And helping someone else can't really be evil. So that's kind of the conclusion that I moved away from. That, well, I thought that was kind of what evil was when I began this little research, but after looking at all the articles, after looking at the different school of thoughts, after actually thinking about this for a couple of weeks now, that might not be the case that is what evil is. So what is evil then? Well, in my opinion, based on the videos, need to hedge here, right? Need to set the context, need to set the stage for you so you don't think that, well, haven't you thought about that particular instance when your argument that you're going to present doesn't hold? And probably no. What I've been looking at is the videos that is in the video library as of, before this video. Roughly, as I said, the 20 videos before, from 194, I believe, to this one. So look up those videos if you want to get the context of where I'm coming from when I'm actually discussing my conclusion here. So looking through the different videos and the different topics that we've been talking about, there has been a consensus of that evil is when you are either consuming or doing something on someone else's expense, which basically means, right, that let's say that for gluttony, for example, there is a finite amount of resources in the world, which means that perhaps every person, just to make it easy, this is just going to be a number, you can distribute that however you want to. But let's say that every person, in order to sustain a good life, right, a good standard of life, they need to have 100 resources. Since there is a finite amount of resources in the world, this means that if you consume 150 resources, you're going to take resources from someone else. And that is what I considered after this to be one of the aspects of being evil. You consuming on the behalf of someone else, or rather on the expense on someone else, which means that they can't consume or they can't do something. And this is going to be applied to more than just, food and living standards. This can be on behalf of, let's see if I can put it into another context on such a short notice. Probably should have thought about this before. But let's say that you have a teacher who has a finite amount of hours to actually look at your different projects right in school. And you are just going after the teacher all of the time, and you're hugging the spotlight, getting a majority of these hours that the teacher has set aside to actually, help other students. It's not evil in the sense that, this action isn't evil in the sense that you want to have help because you deem that you need help and you want to help. And of course you should get the help. However, the idea that you are actually hogging the spotlight and taking it away from the other people who might need it even more than you do, or need it equally as much as you do, even if they need it less, they still have the right to get that help. But since you're taking it away from them, you're consuming and taking something on someone else's expense, which is basically the idea of what is actually evil. Now, I've discussed in different videos some things that I say is, this isn't evil, this is just untasteful. And I think that most people would say that the conclusion I've come to right here is, that's untasteful, but it isn't evil. But according to me, it actually is. Consuming on somebody else's expense is what I would be considering to be evil. No, and then that means, no matter how, depending on the side of the spectrum you are, you can say that, I'm gonna eat all of this food and let all of you starve. That's probably one of the extremes. And on the other hand, you're gonna be like, I'm gonna have one rice corn more than everybody else. That might not even make a difference, but it's still the principle that makes it evil, in my opinion. So just keep that in mind. Of course, if you push it to the different extremes, they might be viewed more evil and more untasteful depending on which side of the spectrum you are, but I'd say it's evil. My conclusion, right? My opinion based on what I've been reading. So that is the first kind of conclusion that we came to. Another like untasteful behavior then in relation to this, so we can actually compare and contrast, is the idea of people being a force of nature as a collective, right? And this is actually bringing in newspapers and stuff as well, because as I was discussing, I think it was yesterday, we had this idea of people in a collective being a force of nature. Now go look at that if you want more in-depth a more in-depth view of what I meant by that. But since we're all a force of nature, when we're a passive, based on the culture that we've been exposed to, are actually based on a lot of newspapers and social media, based on what they think and based on what they say, we're going to have an interpretation and we're going to know, quote unquote, know on how to react in different situations. When I say that that is evil, that different cultural aspects, the immeasurable amount of valuables in the society is, showing you how to behave, not necessarily. I would say that is untasteful and unethical. Or rather, depending on what is actually considered to be a good behavior, you can say, well, that's not unethical, that's actually ethical, whilst I'm saying it's unethical, whilst you think it's ethical. Anyway, it matters less, right? But I'd say that these things, the different cultural values, are just falls under untasteful and not actually evil. Especially when it comes to different newspapers and social media. I wouldn't say go as far to say that that's evil, just untasteful. And then we can also talk about stereotypes, because it was one of the things we were talking about as well. You putting people into a box. Now, yet again, I would argue that if you are stereotype managing, it's also one of these principles that I would consider to be evil, because not because necessarily that you are making stereotypes, right? Because as I said, you need to make sense of the chaotic environment around you. Your brain does that by slotting people and things into different boxes so that they become anchor points, so that you know how to react in the future when a certain event takes place. But since we've come so far in the development of our society, I would say that stereotypes is actually more of a bad thing than a good thing. And that the principle of rather than this, the principle of not questioning stereotypes that you've created yourself, that principle in and within itself is evil, while stereotypes on their own actually aren't. So that's the conclusion there. So we've come to two different conclusions about evil. We're also going to come to the third conclusion about evil, what evil actually is, and that is probably the biggest one that I've been pushing ever since day 1, day 2 and that is the idea, especially prominent when we were looking at the seven deadly sins, because it was all about giving into a certain aspect of life, giving into lust, giving into gluttony, giving into greed. The idea that you're giving into something but you're not fully recognizing that you're giving into something. And that is lying to yourself. Because what is more evil? I mean, really, what is more evil than you doing something, telling yourself that it's good, while you simultaneously both know and feel like it's bad? Because it could be, or rather, if I put it in this context, if I do something to my mate, let's say Greg here, right? Imagine Greg here, and I push him. Now that's untasteful. Is it evil? Who knows? It's based on his interpretation of the act and my interpretation of the act, right? It's up to two people to interpret, was this actually evil, or was it just untasteful, was it just bad, was it called for, was it uncalled for? If there are many people, or rather the more people there is, the harder this is going to be to evaluate. This idea, and that is kind of where my previous two ideas kind of crumbles, this idea that you're not questioning yourself in comparison to the culture around you, in types of stereotypes that you've made up yourself, that you've assumed yourself, and the idea that when I'm consuming on somebody else's behalf, or when I'm consuming at somebody else's expense, is that actually considered evil based on that everybody else around me is doing it in the social circle that I am? So maybe it's not seen as being evil, which means that if it can be seen not being evil, then it might not necessarily be evil. So the two previous ones are kind of iffy, but it's my interpretation of what evil actually is, and I'd say those two actually stand, but there is an argument for why they're not. And that is where this final interpretation actually comes in and say, well, this is actually evil, no matter who you're talking to. Because if you eliminate the people around you, if you eliminate the context of having to rely on other people in order to actually triangulate and identify what is evil, and you take that aspect away and you just have yourself, you're going to come to a true conclusion. Because if you think that something is bad and something is really bad, but you do it anyway, and you lie to yourself, key aspect there, you're lying to yourself, that means that it's not up to anybody else. It's not up to Greg. It's not up to Jerry. It's not up to Lisa. It's not up to anyone around you at all to interpret what is evil or what is wrong. It's up to yourself. But since you know that something is wrong, but you act according with it anyway, then you're actually attaining the highest possible amount of evil that you can. Yet again, lying to yourself, saying that no, this isn't actually bad, I like this. Because yet again, you can't really blame that behavior on anybody else. And it's not up to anybody else to interpret if it's good or bad, it's just up to you. And whilst you're still in alignment and still act in accordance with this, it just makes it worse. I mean, imagine, as I said, you're pushing Greg. Yet again, in order to establish if this is evil or not, we need to ask him, we need to ask me, we need to ask the observers around us. We probably need to have an entire courtroom just giving their opinion on the event, saying if this bad or not, is this evil or not. The entire idea probably why we have a court and a judge system and a legal system to begin with. Other people need to judge what you've done. Is it evil or is it just untasteful? Is it against the law? Is it not against the law? Why is it against the law? Why isn't it against the law? But when you take it down to you, and as I said, eliminate all the variables around you and just take it to you personally, you come down to the conclusion that I'm making up the rules, like in my own life, right? Of course, you need to comply to rules in society, but when it comes to your own principles, you're making up those principles. Some people might argue, right, that well, based on how you've lived your life, there is an impact. Society has an impact on you as a person, on how to create principles, and that is true. That is very true. I am one who is believing that the situational factors has a great deal of influence on who you become as a person and very little on the personal factors on who you actually become. I'm not believing that you are one type of person from birth to that you die. I'm rather interested in seeing that the factors around you impacts you and makes you become a certain person. That might be because I'm in this stage of my life, and later on down the line I will have a totally different perception of it and saying that, well, it was obvious that this wasn't the case now that I'm later on down the line. But as I was seeing it right now, I believe that that is true. So one can argue that, well, then society needs to play a role in this as well. And of course it does. But since it's so hard to actually pinpoint what society and culture and all of these different things, newspaper and social media is doing, that is it evil or not? It's just making me feel like I can't classify that as evil. I rather need to classify that as untasteful behavior if it's something bad, right? Because there are so many things that are good. And simultaneously, if you have the access to the internet these days, and if you have the access to, well, yeah, the internet basically, you can look up other aspects of society, other aspects of other society, gets an informed idea of how the world actually looks like in other places of the world. And this is a hard thing because you need to apply source critique to different sites and so on and so forth. But I would argue that no matter which culture you're actually grown up in, you can now access other cultures and see other people, which means that you can break down stereotypes and actually giving you the power to question your own stereotypes that you made or that the culture and society has made for you, which makes you not being able to say that, well, it's society's fault that I have these different interpretations. Yes, because you now have the power to actually break them. Simultaneously, as you're consuming on somebody else's behalf, somebody else's expense, you can also see it through the internet and get an informed decision and an informed environment that no, this is actually not the case. I can actually see that other people are being hurt by my people's or my society's way of doing things, so I should actually stop doing that. So you have the power to do that as well, and the power of not lying to you. Probably the only thing you don't need the internet for, right? But one can argue that you do, that not the internet necessarily, but that you need a greater opinion and a greater amount of facts, greater amount of information to actually get an informed decision of who you are as a person. And yet again, these influential factors or these situational facts actually having an impact on you so that you can actually question what is right and wrong. But don't lie to yourself. That is the last thing that I'm going to mention, because that is truly evil, or at least that's my interpretation after this little project. I thought it was really amazing and really interesting to look into, and I see that I only have 25 seconds left on the DSLR, so I'm going to be quick. This was a really amazing experience actually looking into it. I'm really interested in the factor or in the matter as of this, and I might do a podcast of it in the future, because I think that 20 minutes, yeah, it's a great deal, but it's not good enough, right? I need to actually talk about this further. I feel that I have more to say on the matter at hand. So, have a nice one, mates, and see you tomorrow.